Jekyll Island, Georgia. Private, gated, owned outright by a club whose membership list read like a directory of American financial power. This is where the Federal Reserve was born, and almost no one was supposed to know. The club cost roughly $125,000 to build in 1888. The men who built it controlled an estimated 1/6 of the world's entire wealth. In November 1910, 6 men boarded a private rail car in New Jersey using only first names, no last names allowed, and told everyone they were going duck hunting. One man on that train was carrying an agenda that had nothing to do with fixing American banking. His real purpose wouldn't surface for years. The legislation they drafted in secret was publicly defeated, then passed almost word for word 2 years later under a different name. This is not a story about a private island. This is a story about who decides what money is worth, and who was in the room when that decision was made permanent. Chapter 1. The Island They Bought Outright. Newton Finney had a brother-in-law with money and a nose for real estate. In 1886, Finney approached Robert Goelet, a New York property heir worth tens of millions, about a scrubby barrier island off the Georgia coast that nobody was doing much with. The local families who hunted there had no attachment to it. The asking price was $125,000 for the entire island. Every acre, every palmetto, every oyster bed. Finney didn't buy it alone. He didn't intend to. The plan was always a club. He circulated the idea among a specific slice of New York society, not industrialists in general, but the inner ring. Men who already knew each other from bank boards and dinner parties and the kind of handshake agreements that never appeared in newspapers. By 1888, the Jekyll Island Club was formally organized with 100 memberships, each priced at $600. The vetting process to become a member was more rigorous than most mortgage applications of the era. Candidates had to demonstrate what the bylaws described as good character, a phrase that in practice meant existing members already knew your name and trusted your money. One blackball from the membership committee could end the application entirely. The Vanderbilts joined. The Morgans joined. Joseph Pulitzer took a cottage. The railroad money came. The shipping money came. The steel money came. In the winter months, the season ran roughly January through April. The island concentrated more private wealth per square mile than any place in the United States. The members built cottages. The word was their choice, which tells you something. These were homes with 14 rooms, wraparound porches, and personal staff imported from the mainland. The club itself had a dining room, a golf course, tennis courts, a stable, and a steam-heated indoor swimming pool, the first in Georgia. Members arrived by private boat from Brunswick, the nearest port. There was no public access. There was no reason for public access. Here is what the island actually was, stripped of the word cottage. A private country capable of making its own rules, accountable only to its own members, staffed by workers who came each season and left when told. The exclusivity was also its fragility. When you build a place that powerful, sealed that completely from the outside world, eventually someone on the outside wants to know what happens inside it. The members of the Jekyll Island Club understood this abstractly. They would learn it concretely, 22 years after the first membership fee was paid. One future member hadn't been born yet when Finney made his pitch to Goelet. His name would end up on every dollar bill in your wallet. Not because he owned the island, he never did. Because of what his family connections made possible in a closed room there, in November 1910, on a night the tide was running hard off the Atlantic coast. Chapter 2. The Senator's Problem. In October 1907, the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York failed. Within days, 14 other banks were in trouble. Depositors lined up around city blocks, to pull their money before the doors closed. The United States government watched and had almost no mechanism to intervene. No central bank, no lender of last resort, no institutional firewall between one bank's panic and the entire system's collapse. J.P. Morgan stepped in personally. Morgan was 70 years old in 1907. He had a red, bulbous nose, a condition called rhinophyma, that he photographed poorly and knew it. He had an office that functioned as a private central bank and a personal library on East 36th Street in Manhattan, where he summoned bank presidents and told them what would happen next. What happened in October and November 1907 was that Morgan locked the presidents of New York's solvent banks in that library and refused to let them leave until they agreed to pool $25 million in emergency credit to stop the cascading failures. It worked. The panic stopped. Morgan had done what no government institution could do. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island watched this and understood the problem exactly. The problem was not that Morgan had acted. The problem was that the solution to an American banking crisis had resided entirely inside one 70-year-old man's willingness to act. And that man was not elected, not accountable, and would not live forever. Aldrich was 66 in 1907. He had represented Rhode Island in the Senate since 1881 and had become the most powerful Republican on financial legislation, which meant he was, in practical terms, the most powerful Republican in the Senate. He was also not a disinterested observer. His daughter Abby had married John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1901. The Rockefeller fortune and the Aldrich family were now the same family. He spent the next 2 years traveling. He kept a personal notebook, dense, methodical, filled with diagrams of how central banking worked in Britain, France, Germany, and 11 other countries, 14 nations in 24 months. He paid particular attention to the German Reichsbank and the Bank of England, both of which could move currency in a crisis without waiting for a legislature to convene. What Aldrich understood and what kept him up at night was a political problem as much as a financial one. Any legislation that openly created a central bank run by private bankers would be killed in Congress before it reached a vote. The Democrats hated concentrated financial power. The rural wing of Aldrich's own party hated Wall Street, and Aldrich himself was the wrong man to propose it publicly. Too connected, too visibly tied to Rockefeller money, too easy a target. The solution he arrived at by 1910 was a structural one. The plan would have to look like it came from Congress. The men who wrote it would have to disappear. The cover story involved birds. Chapter 3. 6 names they didn't use. On the night of November 22, 1910, a private rail car sat on a siding at the Hoboken terminal in New Jersey. Senator Aldrich's car. The porters had been replaced. Regular staff were off the manifest. The 6 men who boarded carried luggage and hunting rifles and, in at least 2 cases, duck guns they did not know how to fire. The standing order was simple. First names only. No last names spoken aloud. No exceptions. If a reporter or a curious railroad employee asked, they were friends on a hunting trip to the Georgia coast. The 6 were Aldrich himself, Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank, which was then the largest bank in the United States; Harry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, who had a reputation for closing deals that other men couldn't get started; Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's personal secretary, there to take notes and keep records; A. Piatt Andrew, the assistant secretary of the Treasury, who provided the government credential the group needed to claim legitimacy; and Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who had emigrated from Hamburg, Germany, in 1902 and had spent the 8 years since arriving in America writing papers and giving speeches explaining why the country's banking system was structurally broken. Paul Warburg had never fired a duck gun in his life. He brought one anyway. Warburg was 50 years old, meticulous. and spoke with a German accent that he never fully lost. He kept notes in English but thought in German, and his draft documents from this period were found with marginal annotations in German, small corrections, structural objections, questions to himself. He was the most technically sophisticated banker on the car. He was also the only one who was not American-born and the only one whose firm's client network ran directly back to European capital, including the Rothschild banking interests. The railcar windows were kept dark through New Jersey and into the South. They traveled through the night. When they reached Brunswick, Georgia, they transferred to a boat and crossed to Jekyll Island after dark. The club had been cleared of other members. The staff who remained had been told not to ask questions and not to repeat what they heard. Vanderlip later described the atmosphere as mysterious, almost eerie. That description, precise as it is, understates the mechanics of what was happening. This was not a secretive atmosphere. This was a deliberate operational security protocol applied to legislative drafting, something that governments do during wartime, not to fishing trips. Here is what Aldrich told the group on that first night. They had 9 days. What they produced had to be complete enough to form the basis of legislation, flexible enough to survive political revision, and this was the constraint that shaped everything. It could not look like it had been written by the men in this room. One man on that rail car was carrying something the others hadn't fully negotiated, a specific structural feature he intended to embed in the plan, regardless of whether it survived the public debate. Not a banking mechanism anyone would argue with. A clause about who, ultimately, controlled the institution once it existed. His name would appear nowhere in the final summary of the meeting. 9 days. That is how long it took 6 men to draft the architecture of American money. Chapter 4. No last names at dinner. The Jekyll Island Club dining room seated 40 comfortably. In November 1910, it seated 6. The other members had been told the club was unavailable for the season's early weeks. No explanation given. The staff who remained, a skeleton crew, reduced from the usual complement of over 100, had been instructed to address the guests by first name only, and to answer no questions about who was present or why. A cook had been brought in separately, Warburg, who had strong opinions about food and had grown up in a household where meals were formal affairs, apparently took over the kitchen on at least 2 evenings, producing dishes the others ate without complaint. Frank Vanderlip later wrote that the atmosphere was mysterious, almost eerie. He meant it as atmosphere. What he was actually describing was operational security. The work started the morning after they arrived. Aldrich set the terms. They would draft a plan for a national reserve system. It would have a central board, regional branches, and the authority to issue currency backed by commercial paper, the short-term business debt that banks held, rather than gold alone. This last point mattered enormously. Tying currency issuance to commercial paper rather than a fixed gold supply meant the money supply could expand and contract with the actual economy. It was technically sophisticated. It was also exactly the kind of mechanism that European central banks had used for decades. They argued about almost everything except the core structure. The most bitter argument was not about interest rates or reserve ratios. It was about a word. The phrase central bank was politically radioactive in 1910. It conjured Andrew Jackson, who had killed the Second Bank of the United States in 1832, and every populist politician since who had warned about Eastern money men controlling the currency. So the phrase was banned from every draft. The institution they were designing would be called something else, anything else. Vanderlip wanted National Reserve Association. Warburg had a different preference, but deferred on the name question, because the name was not what he cared about. He cared about the structure beneath the name. Here is what the 9 days produced: a draft running to several dozen pages that outlined a system of 15 or more regional reserve banks, coordinated by a central board, with the power to set discount rates and issue Federal Reserve notes. The regional structure was the political camouflage. It made the system look decentralized, spread across the country, not concentrated in New York. The operational reality was different. The central board would have the final word. The duck guns leaned against the wall of the billiard room for 8 of those 9 days. On the afternoon of the 8th day, someone pointed out that a fishing boat had been working the waters off the island's eastern shore for most of the morning. It might be nothing. It might be a reporter. They took the guns out to the marsh and fired them twice. Then they went back inside. Not once during those 9 days did anyone say the name of another person in the room out loud in the presence of club staff. The plan was complete on the 9th day. Aldrich called it the Aldrich Plan, which was his first political mistake. The second was putting his name on it at all. Chapter 5. The Clause Nobody Signed. Paul Warburg arrived at Jekyll Island with a specific problem he had been working on for 8 years. He had emigrated from Hamburg in 1902, joining Kuhn, Loeb and Company, one of the most powerful investment banks in the United States. With deep ties to European capital markets, including the Rothschild banking network. His brothers Felix and Max were bankers in New York and Hamburg, respectively. The family operated, in effect, across both sides of the Atlantic simultaneously. Warburg understood, better than anyone else in that dining room, how European central banks actually functioned, because the firms his family represented had been doing business with those institutions for 2 generations. What Warburg had been arguing in print since 1907, in pamphlets, in letters to financial journals, in a paper titled The Defects and Needs of Our Banking System, was a single structural claim. An American reserve system would only work if it was insulated from day-to-day congressional interference, not unaccountable. Insulated. The distinction mattered. Here is the mechanism he was protecting. A central bank that Congress could direct on a week-to-week basis would be subject to electoral pressures. Before an election, a congressman facing a tight race might pressure the bank to lower rates and loosen credit. After a financial crisis, a different congressman might demand the opposite. The bank would become a political instrument rather than a monetary one. Warburg had watched this dynamic destroy the credibility of less insulated institutions in Europe, and he had no intention of building it into the American version. The clause he pushed for, and got in the Jekyll Island draft, established that the reserve system's governing board would set monetary policy independently, without requiring congressional approval for each decision. Appointments would go through the Senate. The overall framework would be set by legislation, but the operational decisions, interest rates, reserve requirements, currency issuance, would belong to the board. This is the clause nobody signed because it wasn't labeled. It wasn't a separate document. It was embedded in the structural language of the draft, in the sections describing the board's authority. Warburg didn't announce it as his contribution. He wrote it into the architecture. Pick up a dollar bill. The words Federal Reserve Note appear across the top. That language traces directly to the independent structure Warburg embedded at Jekyll Island. The note is issued by the Federal Reserve, not by the Treasury, not by Congress, not by the President. That separation is Warburg's fingerprint. Warburg was not an elected official. He had arrived in the United States 8 years earlier. His firm's clients included European creditors who would be doing business with whatever American institution emerged from this drafting session. He had, in other words, a financial interest in designing the institution correctly, and his definition of correctly aligned with the interests of international capital as much as with American monetary stability. Both things were true. They have been in tension ever since. The Aldrich Plan was formally presented to the National Monetary Commission in 1911. It contained Warburg's Independence Clause, camouflaged inside 63 pages of technical banking language. William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic Party's most prominent voice on monetary policy, read it and said publicly that it would put the nation's money supply in private hands. He was describing something real. The reaction in Congress was not subtle. Chapter 6. Defeated, then renamed. The Aldrich Plan reached Congress in 1911 and died there within months. The political math was simple and fatal. Republicans had lost the House in 1910 for the first time in 16 years. The Democrats who replaced them had run partly on opposition to concentrated financial power, and they were not going to hand a legislative victory to Nelson Aldrich, a man whose daughter had married into the Rockefeller fortune, whose name appeared on the plan, and who had represented the interests of Rhode Island's industrial elite for 3 decades. He was, in the language of 1911 politics, radioactive. Aldrich retired from the Senate that same year. He was 69. He had spent 2 years traveling Europe, 2 more years organizing a secret drafting session on a private island, and the remaining months of his career watching his plan be rejected by the institution he had served since 1881. He died in 1915. The Federal Reserve had been operating for 2 years by then, under a different name, with different sponsors, drafted by men who had studied his plan carefully. He never publicly acknowledged the Jekyll Island meeting. The plan that passed was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Its primary sponsors were Carter Glass of Virginia in the House and Robert Owen of Oklahoma in the Senate, both Democrats, both presenting the bill as a reform of the banking system on behalf of the public rather than the banks. Woodrow Wilson signed it on December 23, 1913, at 6:02 in the evening. Banking historians who have compared the 2 documents, the Aldrich Plan of 1911 and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, note that the structural similarities are extensive. Regional reserve banks, a central coordinating board, currency backed by commercial paper, discount rate authority, sitting with the board rather than Congress. The language differs. The architecture does not. The total capitalization required of member banks under the new Federal Reserve System was set at $143 million. That number represented in practice the buy-in for the largest banks in the country. The same banks whose senior partners had drafted the original plan in a hunting club 2 years earlier. Here is what the public record shows. The Aldrich Plan was defeated. The Federal Reserve Act passed. The men who wrote the Aldrich Plan were never publicly credited with the Federal Reserve Act. That is not a coincidence. It is the outcome they designed at Jekyll Island when they decided the plan had to look like it came from Congress, not from a private railcar in New Jersey. The loop from the hook closes here. The legislation drafted in secret was publicly defeated, then passed almost word for word under a different name, with different sponsors 2 years later. The secrecy worked in both directions. It protected the drafting process in 1910, and it protected the authorship in 1913. The men who built it got exactly what they wanted. They got it by not being seen getting it. One of them couldn't live with that. 22 years later, he would sit down and write a memoir explaining exactly what had happened, because he wanted the credit he had been careful to avoid. Chapter 7. The Memoir That Proved Too Much. Frank Vanderlip was 72 years old in 1935 and had been out of banking for over a decade. He had resigned as president of National City Bank in 1919 after a dispute with the bank's board over post-war policy. By the mid-1930s, he was known less as a banker than as a former banker, a distinction that bothered him more than he admitted in print. He was also a good writer. He had been a financial journalist before he became a banker, which gave him a clarity of prose unusual for men in his position. His autobiography, published in 1935 as From Farm Boy to Financier, is direct and specific in a way that most financial memoirs of the era are not. The Jekyll Island chapter runs to several pages. Vanderlip names the participants. He describes the first names rule. He describes the dark railcar windows, the cleared club, the staff under orders to stay silent. He explains that the purpose was to draft banking legislation without triggering political opposition. He presents all of this as reasonable, necessary, and successful. And he seems genuinely puzzled, in retrospect, that anyone might find the secrecy troubling. What Vanderlip was doing was establishing his place in history. He had spent 22 years watching the Federal Reserve operate without his name attached to it, and he was done with anonymity. What he actually did was hand every future critic of the Federal Reserve a primary source in the man's own words. Here is what Vanderlip did not include in those pages: Warburg's independence clause. The European banking interest Warburg represented. The deliberate strategy of making the plan look like it came from Congress rather than from a private club. Vanderlip describes the meeting as a drafting session among public-spirited men solving a real problem. That is not false. It is also not complete. The book sold modestly in 1935. It was not a bestseller. For 2 decades, it sat in the category of financial memoirs read by specialists and ignored by everyone else. Then, in the 1950s and 1960s, as suspicion of centralized institutions grew in American political culture, people started finding it, and finding the Jekyll Island chapter specifically. By the 1970s, the Vanderlip memoir was a staple citation in monetary reform literature from both the left and the right. Anti-Fed writers quoted it alongside the Reese Committee hearings on tax-exempt foundations. Gold standard advocates used it to argue the system had been corrupt from inception. Keynesian critics of financial deregulation used it to argue something almost opposite. The memoir served every argument because it was true in its facts and incomplete in its framing. Vanderlip died in 1937, 2 years after publication. He did not live to see what his candor produced. The Federal Reserve's institutional defenders spent the following decades making a technically accurate argument. The Jekyll Island meeting was a drafting session, not a conspiracy. Legislation was written, submitted to Congress, debated, modified, and passed through democratic process. All of that is true. It is also true that the men who wrote the original draft used false names, traveled in a sealed rail car, cleared a private island, and agreed explicitly that the plan must not appear to have come from the men who wrote it. Both things are true. They remain in tension. Jekyll Island. The place had moved on entirely. The club was still operating through the 1930s, still hosting members whose names appeared in financial directories, still functioning as the most exclusive private resort in the American South. But a threat was coming that had nothing to do with banking policy or congressional debate. Chapter 8: The Last Season. In the summer of 1942, German U-boats sank 19 merchant vessels within visible distance of the Georgia and South Carolina coastlines. Sailors who survived the torpedo strikes washed up on barrier island beaches. The oil slicks from tankers hit at night were visible from shore at dawn. Jekyll Island sat 4 miles off the Georgia coast, connected to the mainland by a single causeway. It had no military fortifications. It had a telephone exchange, a yacht dock, a staff of roughly 30, and a membership of wealthy men who were, by 1942, mostly in their 60s and 70s, and scattered across the country by wartime disruptions. The federal government did not order the club to close. It advised the members, clearly and directly, that the island was indefensible and that their presence there created a security and liability problem. The members voted to suspend operations for the duration. The phrase was standard wartime language. It meant temporary. The last season had actually been 1941. By the time the vote was taken in 1942, most members hadn't been to the island in over a year. The last caretaker, a man named Ernest Gilbert Grob, who had managed the club's physical plant for years, locked the main clubhouse and turned off the water. He left the furniture in place. The dining room chairs were still positioned around the tables. The kitchen equipment stayed. The members' personal effects in the cottages stayed. The duck guns, 2 of them, hanging in the billiard room where they had been since the 1910 season ended, stayed. Grob remained on the island as caretaker through the war years, living in a small cottage near the service entrance, tending the grounds alone. He had worked at the club since the 1920s. He knew what the island had been. He had no way of knowing it would never go back. The war ended in 1945. The members did not return. The reasons were financial and generational simultaneously. The annual cost of operating the Jekyll Island Club had been running at several $100,000 per year by the late 1930s, split among a membership that had shrunk from 100 to under 50 as older members died and younger ones declined to join. The wartime closure had simply made visible what the economics had been signaling for a decade. The club was too expensive to sustain, its membership was dying out, and the era of private barrier island retreats for industrial age millionaires was over. By 1946, the Jekyll Island Club Association was in negotiations with the state of Georgia. The Vanderbilts were gone. The Morgans were gone. The men who had paid $600 to join a club where a private rail car could arrive after dark and no one would ask questions. All of them gone. The furniture sat in the closed dining room. The duck guns hung in the billiard room. The tide came in on the same schedule it had kept since before any of them arrived. The state bought the island the following year. What it paid for an island that had hosted the secret drafting of the American monetary system is a number that lands differently once you know what happened there. Chapter 9. The Rockefeller Dime. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had a habit. Wherever he went, church, a street corner, the lobby of a hotel, he carried a pocket full of shiny new dimes and handed them to strangers, servants, children, porters, anyone who crossed his path. He called it a token of goodwill. The newspapers called it theater. Either way, the man who controlled Standard Oil and whose personal fortune exceeded $900 million by 1913 was handing out 10-cent coins while his son-in-law was redesigning the American monetary system. Rockefeller Sr. visited Jekyll Island on at least one occasion before the war years. He was not unusual there. The island's winter population was saturated with Standard Oil money and the families that orbited it. What made his presence significant was the architecture underneath it. The Rockefeller name was never on the Jekyll Island Club's most consequential document. It didn't need to be. The connection worked like this. Rockefeller Sr. was John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s father. Jr. married Abby Aldrich in 1901. Abby's father was Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the National Monetary Commission and the man who organized the Jekyll Island drafting session. 3 degrees of separation between the world's richest man and the secret meeting that produced the Federal Reserve Blueprint. In Washington, 3 degrees is not distance. 3 degrees is the mechanism. Aldrich had retired from the Senate by 1911 and died in 1915 without seeing his plan pass under his name. But the family connection didn't retire with him. The Rockefeller fortune moved into the next generation, and with it, the proximity to financial power. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, the grandson named directly for the senator, was born in 1908. He would serve as governor of New York for 15 years, as vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford, and as one of the most influential shapers of post-war American domestic policy. His brother David Rockefeller spent 35 years at Chase Manhattan Bank, becoming its chairman and chief executive. David simultaneously sat on the boards of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, which he co-founded in 1973, and a rotating collection of international financial institutions. The distance between the Rockefeller name and American monetary policy, which had been 3 degrees in 1910, had contracted to 1. Here is the connection the story's title promises. Stated plainly, the Rockefeller family's link to Jekyll Island is not ownership and never was. It is the marriage that made Nelson Aldrich the architect of the Federal Reserve Project, which installed an institution whose structural independence was designed in part by a German-born banker protecting European creditors' access to American capital markets. The Rockefeller name is on the story because the Rockefeller marriage is what put the right man in the room. And now the mystery loop that has been open since the hook begins to close. Paul Warburg's agenda at Jekyll Island was not separate from banking reform. It was a specific version of it, shaped by interests the other 5 men in the room did not fully share. Warburg's firm, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, had been the primary American conduit for European investment capital since the 1870s. The firm had financed American railroads, industrial expansions, and government bonds using money raised in London, Frankfurt, and Paris. Its European partners, including the Rothschild banks, were among the largest holders of American financial instruments in the world. When Warburg insisted on central bank independence from day-to-day congressional control, he was solving a real problem. He was also solving a specific problem. A reserve system that Congress could direct politically was a system that Congress could use to favor domestic creditors over foreign ones, to restrict the movement of capital across borders, to make European investment in American institutions legally uncertain. An independent Federal Reserve operating on monetary principles rather than political ones was a Federal Reserve that European capital could work with reliably. That is not a conspiracy. It is a financial interest. It is also exactly what was in the room at Jekyll Island in November 1910, unannounced, undisclosed, and unrecorded in the official summary of the meeting. Warburg was appointed to the first Federal Reserve Board in 1914. He resigned in 1918, not because his work was done, but because the United States was at war with Germany, and a man named Paul Warburg, who had a brother running a major German bank, could not sit on the American Central Bank's governing board without becoming a liability. He offered his resignation voluntarily. It was accepted. He had served 4 years. The independence clause he embedded at Jekyll Island has been operating for more than 100. Chapter 10. The Creature Griffin Made. G. Edward Griffin was 63 years old in 1994 when he published The Creature from Jekyll Island. He was not an economist. He was not a banker. He had made his career producing documentary films and writing books on topics that mainstream publishers declined: cancer treatments, United Nations policy, Soviet subversion. He wore a beard and gave lectures in hotel conference rooms to audiences who distrusted the institutions Griffin described. The book ran to more than 500 pages. Its central argument was that the Federal Reserve was not a government institution in any meaningful sense. It was a cartel of private banks that had captured the machinery of currency issuance and disguised it as a public utility. Griffin sourced his account of the Jekyll Island meeting primarily from Frank Vanderlip's 1935 memoir, and from the writings of economists who had questioned the Fed's structure since the 1960s. His primary source was a man who wrote his memoir to celebrate himself. Griffin's book sold slowly at first, then steadily, then explosively. By the 2000s, it had cleared more than 1 million copies. Ron Paul cited it in congressional testimony. It circulated in Tea Party networks, on libertarian college campuses, in the comment sections of financial news websites. It was translated into multiple languages. Mainstream economists dismissed it in reviews that most of its readers never saw. Here is what Griffin got right. The Jekyll Island meeting happened. The participants used false names. The meeting was secret by design. The plan drafted there became the structural basis of the Federal Reserve Act, an independent central bank with the power to expand and contract the money supply was designed by men who were not elected, meeting in a place they cleared of witnesses, under a cover story about birds. All of that is documented. Vanderlip documented it himself. Here is what Griffin built on top of that. Foundation: a theory of deliberate multi-generational conspiracy in which the Federal Reserve functions as a tool of private enrichment at the expense of the American public. His evidence for the conspiracy layer is thinner than his evidence for the secrecy layer, but the secrecy layer is real enough to make the conspiracy layer feel credible. The men at Jekyll Island would have recognized this problem immediately. It is the exact problem they were trying to prevent by keeping the meeting secret in the first place. The secrecy was meant to protect the plan from political opposition during the drafting stage. Instead, it became permanent evidence of illegitimate intent, a documentation gap that conspiracy literature filled with its own explanations. The loop closes here. They were secret to survive. The secrecy ensured they would never fully survive scrutiny. Griffin did not invent the question. He amplified a question that was already in Vanderlip's memoir, in Congressional Debates from 1913, in the writings of Louis McFadden, the Pennsylvania congressman who spent the 1930s accusing the Federal Reserve of engineering the Great Depression. The question itself is legitimate. Who designed the institution that controls American monetary policy, and whose interests did that design serve? The Federal Reserve's own defenders answer, it served the American economy, which needed a lender of last resort and a mechanism to prevent banking panics. That is also true. The Fed's response to the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 pandemic, each time expanding its balance sheet by trillions, represents a power to intervene in the economy that no institution in 1910 could have fully anticipated. By 2022, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet had reached approximately $9 trillion. The institution that 6 men outlined in 9 days at a private hunting club on a Georgia barrier island now manages a monetary instrument larger than the GDP of every country on Earth except the United States and China. Griffin's book sits on Amazon with more than 4,000 reviews. The Federal Reserve's official history of itself is available as a PDF. The island, meanwhile, had become a public park. Chapter 11. The $675,000 transaction. In 1947, Georgia Governor Ellis Arnold sat across a table from the representatives of the Jekyll Island Club Association and negotiated the purchase of an island. Arnold was 40 years old, a New Deal Democrat who had already made his reputation by abolishing the poll tax in Georgia in 1945, and by winning a lawsuit against railroad freight rate discrimination that reached the Supreme Court. He was not a man who found private power arrangements charming. The club members who remained, fewer than 50, scattered by the war, unwilling to pay to reopen a seasonal resort they hadn't used in 5 years, accepted the state's offer of $675,000 for the entire island. The island that Newton Finney had pitched to Robert Goelet for $125,000 in 1886 had appreciated by exactly $550,000 over 61 years. For context, the Federal Reserve System had expanded the United States money supply from approximately $20 billion in 1913 to over $160 billion by 1947. The island's price had barely moved. What had happened inside it had not. State employees arrived on Jekyll Island in 1947 and found the clubhouse exactly as Ernest Gilbert Grob had left it. Dining room chairs still at the tables, kitchen equipment still in the kitchen, personal effects in the member cottages, winter clothes, sporting equipment, books left open on side tables as if someone had stepped out for an afternoon and not returned. In the billiard room, 2 duck guns hung on the wall where they had been since 1910. The state of Georgia designated Jekyll Island a state park. For the first time in 60 years, a member of the American public could set foot on the island without a personal invitation and a vetting process. The ferry from Brunswick cost less than $1. The same water crossing that Aldrich's group had made in darkness after a sealed rail journey from New Jersey was now a 12-minute public boat ride available to anyone. The Jekyll Island Club building itself was not demolished. It sat through the late 1940s and 1950s, being used as a conference center and seasonal hotel for state employees and their families. The cottages were rented. The golf course was maintained. The records of the club, membership ledgers, correspondence, financial accounts, the guest registers that listed every man who had arrived and departed since 1888, were transferred to state custody. A formal restoration of the Jekyll Island Club began in the 1970s and continued through the 1980s and 1990s. The main clubhouse was renovated as a hotel. The cottages were rehabilitated. A museum was established in one of the outbuildings. The duck guns were kept. Arnold's $675,000 purchase had acquired something the transaction documents did not mention: a physical record of the most consequential private meeting in American financial history, preserved in amber by wartime closure and left entirely intact for the state to inherit. The $8 parking fee that greets visitors today is the entire cost of access to an island that once screened applicants for moral character and charged $600 for the privilege of belonging. That contrast is not symbolic. It is a market transaction. The same mechanism that built the club, funded the Federal Reserve drafting session, and eventually sold the whole enterprise to a government that spent $675,000 on something the original buyers paid $125,000 to acquire and 60 years to make irreplaceable. The most exclusive private island in American history is now a public beach. The room where the Federal Reserve was drafted is now a hotel conference room available for corporate retreats. Catering is extra. Chapter 12. What the Placard Doesn't Say. The Jekyll Island Club Hotel charges $279 per night for a standard room in the main building. Breakfast is available in the dining room, where 6 men once ate dinner under false names and argued about what to call an institution that did not yet exist. The hotel operates tours. A guide walks guests through the main hall and stops near a wall display noting that in November 1910, a group of financial leaders met here to draft what became the Federal Reserve Act. The placard's exact wording varies depending on which account you read, but the phrasing tends toward historic gathering. It notes the secrecy. It mentions the false names. Tour guests laugh at the duck hunting cover story and take photographs. The guide does not mention Warburg's independence clause. No placard explains that a German-born banker with European creditor clients embedded a structural feature into the draft that insulated monetary policy from direct congressional control for the next century and beyond. No sign names the Rothschild network. The deliberate strategy of making the plan appear to originate in Congress rather than in this room. That detail does not appear on any wall in the building. A duck gun hangs in the hotel, not in a locked case, not behind rope. On the wall, where anyone walking past can stop and look at it. It is presented as a period artifact, a piece of the club's hunting heritage. There is no placard on the gun itself explaining that it was carried to this island as a prop, fired twice off a marsh for the benefit of a fishing boat that may or may not have been carrying a reporter, and then hung on a wall for 80 years, while the institution it was meant to disguise became the most powerful monetary authority in the world. The gun that never hunted anything is now decor. The institution it helped conceal manages a balance sheet larger than the GDP of every nation on Earth except 2. 47,000 people visit Jekyll Island each year. Some book rooms in the club building, some take the historic district walking tour, some eat in the dining room. A smaller number specifically come because they read The Creature from Jekyll Island, or heard a podcast about the Federal Reserve's origins and wanted to stand in the room where it happened. Every dollar those visitors spend on the island, the hotel rate, the parking fee, the tour ticket, the dinner, is denominated in Federal Reserve notes, issued by the institution drafted in the building they are standing in, by men who asked each other to use first names only and told the staff not to ask questions. The room is available for private events. Minimum guest count applies. Catering is handled in-house. Chapter 13. First Names Only. Paul Warburg resigned from the Federal Reserve Board in August 1918. He submitted a letter to Woodrow Wilson explaining that his German birth and his brother Max's position running Germany's financial war effort had made his continued service a political liability he was unwilling to impose on the institution. Wilson accepted the resignation. Warburg had served 4 years on the board he helped design. His name appeared in the resignation letter. It did not appear in the public summary of the Jekyll Island meeting, which would not be widely known for another 17 years. Warburg died in 1932, the year before Franklin Roosevelt began dismantling the gold standard, and the year before Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. His son, James Paul Warburg, became a financial advisor to Roosevelt's administration, and later, in February 1950, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. James told the committee, on the record, in public, that the world was moving toward a single global government, whether nations chose it or not, and that the only question was whether that government would be established by consent or by conquest. The testimony was quoted for the next 70 years by people arguing opposite things about what it meant. The Warburg family had spent half a century being cited as evidence of things they did not quite do, by people who could not quite explain what they meant. Nelson Aldrich never acknowledged the Jekyll Island meeting publicly. He died in 1915 with his name on a failed plan and his structural logic embedded, unmarked, in the law that replaced it. His grandson Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller served as Vice President of the United States from 1974 to 1977, appointed, not elected, under the 25th Amendment, confirmed by a Congress that spent considerable time examining the Rockefeller family's financial holdings before the vote. The holdings were valued at approximately $218 million at the time of the confirmation hearings. Frank Vanderlip wanted to be remembered. He is remembered, primarily as the man whose memoir handed G. Edward Griffin a primary source. Griffin's book has now been in print for 30 years. Vanderlip's memoir has been out of print for most of that time. The Federal Reserve has operated continuously since 1913. It has navigated the Great Depression, World War II, the inflation of the 1970s, the 2008 financial collapse, and a global pandemic that required it to expand its balance sheet by more than $3 trillion in 8 weeks. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks it operates today trace their structure directly to the Aldrich Plan draft, the regional architecture that was designed at Jekyll Island to make the system look decentralized. Not one of the 6 men who drafted that structure used their last name in the presence of another person for 9 consecutive days. The institution they designed in that time is now 111 years old. It has never been audited in full by Congress. Its governing board members are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but its operational decisions, interest rates, reserve requirements, open market operations, belong to the board alone, insulated from direct legislative direction by the structural clause that Paul Warburg argued for and nobody signed. Jekyll Island is lit up tonight. A wedding reception is running in the main ballroom of the club building. 200 guests, a band, an open bar denominated in Federal Reserve notes. The dock where Aldrich's group transferred from the Brunswick Ferry in November 1910 is used tonight for kayak rentals and sunset tours. The duck gun on the wall has not moved. The men who built the Federal Reserve asked each other to use first names only. 114 years later, we're still trying to learn the rest. Ending. Jekyll Island, Georgia. You can drive there now. The causeway has been open since 1954. The parking fee is collected at a booth before you reach the historic district. The club building is a hotel. The cottages are vacation rentals. The billiard room where the duck guns leaned against the wall for 8 days in 1910 is part of the restored historic district tour. The dining room where 6 men ate together under false names serves a weekend brunch buffet. If you've been to Jekyll Island, I want to hear about it. The island that a group of New York financiers bought for exclusivity became, through a war and a state purchase and 60 years of public access, the most democratic version of itself, open to anyone with a parking fee and an afternoon. The institution those same men designed in 9 days became, through a century of crises and expansions, the most powerful financial authority in the world. The most exclusive private island in American history is now a public beach. The most secret financial meeting in American history is now a hotel tour. Sources and further reading in the description.